Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. Apologies to the audience. We had taken a bit of a break because it's been so incredibly busy on our end. But we're back and we're happy to be back. And this week I've got Michael with me, who's not been on for quite a long time. Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Good, Meg. It has been ages since I've been on the podcast, so it is nice to be back. We head into summer and to talk about some good business of law stories. So yeah, let's kick off.
Yeah. So I guess before we take on the business of law, obviously we're recording this on Thursday, 4th of July, which is election day here in the UK. So I guess as of tomorrow, I think that the consensus across the country is that we're going to have a new government. Interesting times, obviously, over the weekend. France is also voting for the second round. It's going to be the final round in those legislative elections as well. So I guess from next week in France, there's going to be also a new government. And then later on this year, obviously, there's the US election. So there's a lot going on. Michael, what do you think? Well, how do you think the UK elections, at least, will kind of impact the market, if at all?
Look, I mean, it's an exciting day. It's always good to have a general election. I think that what we have also is, for the first time in a long time, we're going to have somebody from legal profession as most likely, well, who's going to be the next Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer. And, you know, that's worth noting. You know, we've had a government that has been very oppositional to the legal profession, and to some extent the rule of law over certainly recent years, certainly since maybe 2016 after the Brexit referendum and since then. So to have a government, as we expect to see from tomorrow, led by a lawyer, a successful one at that, is a significant break from what we've seen in recent years. Does it mean that, you know, everything is going to be perfect, etc., etc.? Does it mean the justice system is going to get all the funding needs out of nowhere immediately? Does it mean that the damage that the last few years has done to the UK's reputation in terms of its commitment to the rule of law is going to be repaired overnight? No, but it does set a new tone, and I think things will feel quite different. And I think that the sort of fighting between government and the sort of attacks on the legal profession will likely cease immediately. And obviously, separate to that, a new legislative agenda, a government with a new legislative agenda after the kind of, you know, this Parliament, despite having a large majority of the government, the Conservatives have struggled to really push legislative changes through at scale. I mean, COVID interrupted an awful lot of that, and it would be unfair to say otherwise. But even so, there's been a bizarre amount of sort of log-jammed stuff and things not having been passed. And obviously, you don't want legislation for the sake of it, but you know, a new manifesto. We've got commitments to planning and reform, a lot of, you know, to really enable infrastructure, really enable more housing. Is that going to happen overnight? No, but it does require legislative change to facilitate it and to lay the groundwork for it. And, you know, the indications are that some of that's going to start to flow immediately. And obviously a government with a large majority and a clear manifesto that it's been elected on that says it's going to, you know, reform planning and enable building, that should happen pretty quickly. So, you know, new government led by a lawyer, new legislative agenda, legislation coming through relatively quickly to enable change set out in manifesto. Yeah, I'm pretty positive about the next 6 months.
Okay, well, that's good. I hold obviously very different views. As for France, I mean, I kind of want to touch upon it because it's interesting. The situation there is very volatile. Obviously, economically, I think for a long time, our current president has really tried to push kind of France as like a, like up and coming European market for, finance and, tech and whatnot. And I think obviously COVID was kind of slowing that down, and then, it's got back on track. And now with this election, I think a lot of people are going to be they're not going to be reassured, let's just say, with whoever comes next. So I don't know, it's interesting over the last few weeks that the stock market kind of plunged. As of yesterday, it's kind of, it's coming back to normal because I think there's more certainty as to what to expect. But, that said, we know what the result is likely to be. I'm not sure many people in the kind of business industry will be happy with that. So yeah, definitely one to watch. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of people forget it's a political cycle, and the political cycle is not consistent across different countries. So you have got Europe having swung to the right after a period of kind of having centre-left governments in charge for a sustained period of time. You've got the US oscillating back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, as it has wanted to do in an increasingly volatile kind of way. And you've had the UK, which swung right in certain respects, at least culturally, for a sustained period, while most of Europe was not like that, and now is likely to go centre left. So there is a political cycle playing out here, but is running at different speeds and at different points in different parts of the world. And it is quite hard to pick out genuine global trends in that. But overall, I think we can all agree that democracy is a good thing. And, if we think about the amount of change that it enables, we're going to have a lot of new governments, we're going to have a lot of new legislation. There will be a lot of work for lawyers to do to help their clients navigate all of this.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Moving on next to financial reporting season. So obviously a lot of UK firms have closed their accounts. So it's interesting. Results are coming out. There's not been that many so far, which is a bit surprising. But so far I think it's kind of somewhat stable. Not expecting huge amounts of kind of increases, unlike some of the US firms at the end of last year. But it should be really interesting. There are some firms that are actually doing fairly well, but any thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's been from what we can see, I actually think it's been a good year for the UK firms so far. There's been a lot of most of the firms that have reported so far are either the kind of smaller or mid-market international firms. I think Stevenson Harwood and Field Fisher put their numbers out. Some Osborne Clark as well. Some of them regional firms like Brabner's and others have also come out with results already. So and they it's tending to be kind of high single digit to mid up to sort of 10 to 15%, I think, seems to be the going rate in terms of revenue growth. Profits sort of varying a little bit between 5-6% all the way up to 16-17%, depending on firms. But the cycle, I think, it's a lot more positive than I think people would have expected maybe 2 or 3 months into the financial year. And I think it does speak to a bit more optimism, a bit more activity, some the economy being in better shape in 2024 than perhaps we expected it to be. And we'll see how that carries through to the bigger firms if they start reporting, which obviously they haven't done as yet. But that should be coming over the next 6 weeks or so. The financial reporting cycle has been pushed a little bit back, I think. It's tended to get later and later every year, almost to the point that now it really is a sort of a mid-July kind of thing. So we should expect to see the big firms reporting over the next couple of weeks. And I would expect that they will be similarly positive. It might not be quite the, 20% of it that some US firms have achieved, but I don't think it's going to be too far off. And there seems to be a pretty good vibe in terms of positive results, which when we think about recent pay war, or the ongoing pay war, it does sort of underline that a lot of firms, they can afford these pay increases, and their financial performance does accommodate such things. What about you? What do you any thoughts from you, Meg?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I also feel that, if the results are so good for the bigger firms, how come nobody's come out yet? And that they're letting kind of the more mid-market firms come out first with their good results. So it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what to expect, really. I do think most of them will be fine. But yeah, I think, I don't know. I'm not sure what to expect. It's going to be a very interesting season. The one I'm really keen to see is the one for A&O Sherman, which obviously merged in May. So I think we'll probably have the last A&O financials before it merged. So yeah, it would be good to see that, just out of curiosity. But yeah, I'm not really sure what to expect from the big firms.
I think you're right. I mean, I don't know how much you'll be able to tell from a merged entity's initial financials, which don't account for a financial year when it was merged. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. We'll find out in the next couple of weeks, I guess.
For sure. Moving on to another story. This one was in law.com, and Paul Hodkinson wrote it around the global elite. And it's quite a long piece discussing kind of who's part of that global elite and kind of the metrics used for it. In short, so in the piece, it says that, kind of lawyers, part of that elite, consider that you can only be considered part of the elite if you've got around minimum $3 billion revenue as a firm, minimum 4.5 mil of dollars in terms of PEP, and if you've got like a significant global presence, meaning offices in different jurisdictions. So it's kind of fascinating. Quite a few firms are named in that, most of which actually are American firms, or transatlantic ones. So interesting piece. What were your initial thoughts, Michael?
Look, I think in terms of benchmarking the global legal profession, which is, increasingly dominated by the biggest US firms, you've got to have some kind of metrics for identifying who's genuinely in the elites from a business of law perspective. I'm not saying that there aren't super elite firms operating from one or two or a small handful of offices doing super premium work, but they're not kind of global elite because the clue's in the name. There does need to be a degree of geographical footprint, and hey, I don't think you can argue with the fact that you need to have a sort of a trifecta of different metrics here across geographical footprint of operating in more than 15 countries, or at least 15 countries, revenues more than 3 billion and PEP of 4.5 million. You can argue about whether those measures are quite right, but the interesting thing is that only Latham & Watkins actually ticks all of those boxes. But there are a few others who are not far behind, and ticking at least two of those. So I think it's fascinating. I think that you do have this group of firms that is kind of pulling away. I don't think you're going to have a situation where you're ever going to have like the accountants where, it's 4 or 5 giant mega firms dominating market share. That's not going to happen. If you think about the total volume of legal work available, even the global elite are only going to have a relatively small percentage of all the work available, but they are going to have a super proportion of all the very significant work, the premium work, the premium transactional work, the big ticket litigation work, and they will be they are continuing to grow their market share significantly from that perspective. And I think you have to look at it in a layered way. They're not interested in doing commoditized work, lower value work. It's not market share for market share's sake. It's market share for that premium, transactional and contentious work.
Interestingly, I mean, I quite disagreed with the piece, based on the metrics used. Because, from my point of view as a journalist, where you're kind of, you're stuck with what you've got, with what the firms are giving out, right? So there is that kind of difficulty of, you're given some statistics, that do tell a story, some kind of story, and that do tell you some things about a firm and how well it's doing or how badly it's doing. And it's important to note for sure. But I actually think a better metric, which is obviously much harder to measure, would be around what actually makes them elite, and usually is the client experience, the type of quality of that experience, and the quality of the relationship with the clients as well as internally, the culture internally of how people are working together, and whether that is a success story as well. Because I'm sorry, there's a bunch of firms who, yes, might be really profitable, but at the same time, at what cost internally, so I'm not sure money, or even geography are good enough factors to say whether someone's at the top or not. I think it tells you, yeah, you've got a lot of money, you've got a lot of lawyers, you're present in different jurisdictions. Also, what does that mean, being present in different jurisdictions? Because you might have, I don't know, an office in Kenya with only 2 people, but for all you know, maybe those 2 people actually bring in, 20% of your revenue and are actually really, really productive, and actually have very long-term relationships, positive relationships with clients, and are managing the office really well. But for all you know, maybe the people you've got there actually don't, you might have 15 people in Italy, and actually they're not producing as much, they don't get along, and they don't actually bring in that much work. They don't, it's quite a quieter office. So it's kind of, being present for the sake of being present, to me, doesn't really mean that much. And I actually think that the way you measure success of an office shouldn't be just by being present and how many people you're making in terms of hires. I don't know. I think it's a much more complex picture. I think it's fine to have those metrics and to consider them. But I do think that a lot of smaller firms, including boutiques actually, are excellent at what they do. And I think by saying that, a lot of litigation boutiques are actually global, because even though they don't have presence anywhere outside of, say, the UK or the US, their cases are quite often very global, and they have to travel around quite a lot and take on cases in multiple jurisdictions. And I think you're automatically, if you're just basing the elite based on these criteria that are in the piece, I think you're missing out a lot of the market that actually, are able to do great work. They might not be paid, 5 mils, but it's kind of, I don't know. I think it's missing out a lot in the market, and I'd welcome views on that actually from the wider market, because I think it misses out a lot personally.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one, Meg. I think I'm team Paul, in terms of, you've got to have some yardsticks for measuring the top of market and profitability, your revenue and your geographical footprint. He's not trying to capture everything. I think that's how far you can take this. I don't think it necessarily tells you about the huge amount of incredibly profitable firms that are incredibly good at what they do, and are incredibly successful, that aren't part of the global elite. They shouldn't, they don't want to be necessarily. But the point is that there is, you got to have some benchmarks. Terms like magic circle, silver circle, but increasingly meaningless, out of date.
Yeah.
On the quality side of things, you could take, which firms have got the highest average chambers rankings, but it's not necessarily scientific, but they speak to hundreds and hundreds of clients.
Agreed.
So you got to have some kind of benchmarking. And this is a business of law publication, law.com, and it's about measuring the success of the success of firms on their own terms. And there is
What?
no doubt that a group of firms have managed to have started to pull away in recent years for various reasons. And the question is whether they will continue to do so or if others will close that gap.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what surprises me is that the clients, none of the clients are quoted in the piece. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of, I think that's a key metric to use and kind of just getting a
But
sense.
how are you going to measure it? How are you going to?
Well, you actually speak to GCs. There's a reason why firms like Soter and May have, the relationships that they do with their clients. And, they've worked on this for decades and decades and decades. But the fact is, not only, it's not that it's not about winning the clients, because that's hard in itself, but actually, more importantly, I think it's retaining them. And these people have managed to kind of retain these clients for so long, and they're really high profile. And these are the types of clients that wouldn't go to anyone else for certain types of work. There's a reason for that. And I think quite often it comes down to, not just the, I think it doesn't just come down to the quality of work, but I think it's also about, the trust that you've got with your advisor. They will know exactly what partner to go to. And I think, if a firm like that, for example, I'm like, well, they're not going to make this kind of ranking, obviously, but it's really important to recognize that there's a lot of those types of firms out there across different markets.
I completely agree. I completely agree. But they're not the global elites. You can be an amazingly good firm or an amazingly good lawyer. 100%. There will be amazingly good lawyers up and down the country and around the world who do fantastic work for, regular people. Or small. There will be somebody who is the best in the business at advising SMEs. There are people who do amazingly good work for people going through painful divorces and etc. Who are great lawyers. But on its own terms, this is about who are the biggest and most successful and most profitable law firms in the world. And looking at margin, looking at revenue, not margin, so looking at profit per equity partner, looking at revenue and looking at geographical footprint is a good way of looking. Just trying to measure overall quality, etc. But who are the global top firms that scoop up tons and tons of money, do it really profitably, and are in all the key commercial centers around the world? And that's all he's looking at, I think. So, but you can't stretch it too far. And I personally slightly disagree with not including the Rhine firms because it's just a business structure. It doesn't. I think you get lost in, oh, well, this firm's got, 4 profit pools and this firm's got 2 profit pools and whatever. And there's a point at which it doesn't really make any difference. But so I would slightly disagree with Paul on the Rhine front, but I think having for the American lawyer or law.com needs a way to measure global success. And this is a good way of doing it, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, personally, I think there's a lot lacking now. And let's agree to disagree, but I think it's quite reductive. I do appreciate the piece, though. It's an interesting insight for sure. It is interesting. I just think that it misses out a lot. So, Paul, if you're listening, let's go for coffee and discuss this because, I'm really keen to see what you were thinking about when you wrote this. But anyway, moving on. This is going to be the last story of the day. Well, actually, I think it was yesterday that Deckard announced it was closing 3 offices, one in Chicago, one in Hong Kong, and in Beijing. Obviously, it's not the only firm to have closed down in China recently. There's been quite a few. In Hong Kong, I think it might be one of the first few ones to close there. The firm still has a base in Asia, in Singapore. So I think it's going to mostly rely on that office for all their Asia Pacific work. But yeah, there's still questions around Chicago. And the firm said that, it was just kind of after a review of the business that they decided to close these 3 offices. Any thoughts on that, Michael?
I think it's interesting. It's unusual to see an announcement of a big firm closing multiple offices. in different locations like this. I think it's obvious that China, from a geopolitical perspective, has become increasingly challenging for US firms to operate in directly. And Hong Kong is increasingly, from a
security, I guess.
a security perspective, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. From a security laws perspective, increasingly integrated with China, mainland China, which poses questions for firms as to how they manage that. We've seen issues, Latham's and others have taken action there, but firms have not generally been pulling out. I think it will be interesting to see if for Hong Kong this marks a bit of a watershed moment where others will now follow. Now that somebody's been sort of like taking a decision to pull the trigger in terms of focusing on Singapore only as a base, as opposed to Singapore and Hong Kong. So there's a question over whether it's a sign of a trend to come or a Deckard-specific decision. Chicago is a bit of a weird one. I mean, Chicago, I don't really get. Having spent some time there, having previously worked at Baker's, etc. Chicago is like it's the most global business city in America, apart from New York. It's a top 5 city in terms of size of the economy in the world, and I think it's home to a bigger proportion of international global companies than just about or almost anywhere else in the world. So, it may be that the mix of the client base that Deckard has doesn't really map onto things. Well, it might be the case that the office just hasn't worked out because for various reasons. I don't know, but that one doesn't. I mean, it doesn't fit, as you say, Meg. It doesn't fit with the trend in terms of the geopolitical rationale, which makes perfect sense in terms of Beijing being increasingly difficult because of the tensions and the security laws, data protection, data privacy, and a general trend towards Singapore over Hong Kong, which we've seen in recent years. So yeah, that makes sense. For Chicago one, it could just be that it just didn't work out, and that happens. I've worked at firms where we've closed offices in the US because you had team changes or departures, and it just didn't make sense at that time. But firms close offices and locations sometimes, and then a few years later reopen when the right opportunity comes along.
I think it's an interesting story. I mean, definitely in Asia, everyone's keeping a close eye on what's happening over there because we expect probably others to follow through in the coming years, which is a real shame for business there overall, to be honest, not just the legal industry. But yeah, the one in Chicago is the one that stands out. It's an interesting one. Hopefully that will be the only US base that they close down for now, and hopefully at one point they'll reconsider reopening that again. But yeah, for now it doesn't seem likely. So interesting things all around. On that note, that's the end of the podcast today. Feel free to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I guess I'll be back next week with, I think Liam is coming on the podcast next week, so that should be interesting. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Meg. It's been great to come on again, and interesting times, and always fun to chat.
All right, bye everyone.
Listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal